The world's strategic landscape, it's fundamentally shifting. And recent headlines, they're screaming a clear message. America is reassessing its global commitments. This means a critical moment for alliances, for national interests all around the globe. Just days ago, President Trump made a remarkably bold move. He ordered two nuclear submarines to reposition after what he called highly provocative statements from former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev had even mentioned Russia's chilling dead-hand nuclear retaliation system.
Yeah, and what's truly significant here, I think, is that this is far more than just words than rhetoric. This dramatic nuclear signaling, whether it was, adjusting existing patrols or deploying new assets, it shows a clear willingness to use a kind of sledgehammer approach to deployment.
Sledgehammer, right.
Exactly. Some might dismiss it as just chatter, but it's a profound signal. It signals deep frustration, probably, with the lack of progress in peace talks. And it just underscores how incredibly high the stakes are in this geopolitical chess match. And that dead hand system you mentioned, for anyone unfamiliar, it's Cold War stuff. An automated system meant to launch a retaliatory strike even if Russian leaders are wiped out. Terrifying, really.
Absolutely terrifying. And that's precisely why today we're doing a deep dive. We're looking into these seismic shifts in U.S. defense strategy, Europe's changing role in its own security, and what America First actually signifies for alliances like NATO. We'll look at the data, the demands, the critical choices ahead, choices impacting your security and, crucially, your tax dollars. Okay, so let's unpack this foundational issue first. For decades, the United States has shouldered, well, a disproportionate share of NATO's defense costs. And there's this widespread feeling, it seems to be growing among many Americans, that they're not just footing the bill for Europe, but also acting as the world police.
Yeah, and what's historically fascinating here is the pattern this created. European nations have, for a long time, really underinvested in their own militaries. They've consistently failed to meet that agreed-upon 2% of GDP defense spending target.
The 2% target, right.
And the U.S. has largely carried this huge load, which, ironically, allowed many European countries to focus more on, say, extensive social programs.
Like socialized medicine.
Exactly, like socialized medicine, rather than building up truly robust military capabilities. Some call it a moral hazard.
Yeah.
Europe felt secure under the U.S. umbrella, so they prioritized domestic spending. It really changed their defense industry, their political will over decades.
And President Trump, he's been exceptionally vocal about this imbalance. He's demanded higher targets, even pushing for allies to contribute 5% of their GDP. That's a figure most just don't come close to meeting, even while relying on American protection.
Indeed. Though this sustained pressure has started to yield some results, NATO itself reported a noticeable increase in defense spending among European members after 2016. But the fiscal reality for the U.S. is biting now. The Department of Defense itself is planning an 8% annual budget cut.
8%? Wow.
Yeah, because of soaring national debt, fiscal deficits. So this isn't just about fairness anymore. It's about hard fiscal reality for the U.S. It just intensifies the demands. Allies need to contribute more, significantly more, or face real cuts in U.S. troops, joint exercises. It's about American solvency, too.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think, because the whole strategic focus seems to be visibly shifting. The Trump administration's interim national defense strategic guidance, it makes this profound, singular shift. It explicitly names China as the #1 U.S. defense planning priority. And it explicitly states the U.S. would assume risk in other theaters, specifically naming Europe.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it signals a huge reorientation. This guidance effectively means the U.S. is, no longer planning for large-scale conventional military operations in Europe. Not for the foreseeable future.
So Europe needs to step up itself.
That's the expectation. Significantly more self-reliant for its own defense. There's serious talk about withdrawing some of those 20,000 additional U.S. troops currently in Eastern Europe. And maybe relocating critical military capabilities, advanced air power, naval forces to the Indo-Pacific.
A big move.
A very big move. Some analysts call it a reverse Nixon strategy. Remember Nixon engaging China to isolate the Soviets? This idea is maybe engaging Russia, perhaps through concessions, to isolate China, to prevent a unified Sino-Russian front. Theoretically, lets the U.S. focus resources on the main challenge, the Indo-Pacific.
So this whole reorientation, it's clearly driven by China's rapid rise, and the U.S. needing to focus its resources on what it sees as the most critical threats. And that directly challenges the traditional role of NATO, which was formed, let's remember, to counter Russia in a very different world. Now, despite all the criticism and the calls for more spending, it's not all one-sided. Some European countries are stepping up. They're making significant investments.
Absolutely, that's important to note. Poland, for instance, spent almost 4% of its GDP on defense in 2023. That's more than any other NATO country. And Poland has actively called for a 3% target for all allies.
4%. That's substantial.
It is. And look at the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They consistently exceed the 2% target. Yeah, Estonia's military aid to Ukraine alone was over 1.5% of its GDP. And they're buying crucial stuff like HIMARS rocket systems,
Right.
those precision artillery systems and advanced anti-ship missiles. They see the threat clearly.
They're on the front line, after all.
Exactly. Romania, too, is surging past 2%, aiming for 2.5% of GDP on defense. They're building the largest NATO airbase in Europe to project power into the Black Sea. These frontline nations, they understand security isn't free.
Right. But then you have countries like the UK. They're doing a dramatic defense overhaul, building new nuclear subs, munitions factories. But they still fall short of that 5% target President Trump mentioned. So even big increases might not meet this new, higher bar.
Which raises a really important question.
Yeah.
What actually happens if the U.S. significantly reduces its military footprint in Europe? Think about the logistics, the money. Renegotiating those host nation agreements with Germany, Italy, they've been quite generous for decades, providing bases, infrastructure. That could lead to losing crucial support. It would mean substantially higher costs for the U.S. if it ever needed to redeploy forces quickly in a crisis. There's a real economic and strategic cost to pulling back too far. It's complex for U.S. taxpayers and strategists.
And the ongoing, just brutal conflict in Ukraine really highlights the consequences of these strategic no man's lands, doesn't it? These vulnerable regions, without a clear security guarantor, seem like an open invitation for Russian aggression.
And Russia is indeed escalating. They're openly targeting civilian infrastructure, even American-owned assets in Ukraine.
Yeah.
President Zelensky called them deliberate attacks on American property. Russian forces recently gained, 105 square miles of Ukrainian territory in just 1 week. That's alarming. 3 times the rate of the previous week.
Wow.
And Ukraine faces huge challenges. Conscription difficulties are widespread. A recent survey found 77% distrust draft offices. Only about 10% of new recruits are volunteers. It paints a picture of a society under enormous strain.
And President Trump has visibly shifted U.S. support, at one point cutting off intelligence sharing, military aid. He's also reportedly demanded Ukraine repay previous aid with interest, pushed for mineral deals. It signals a very transactional approach.
A business-like approach from that perspective. The idea that U.S. aid should have direct returns for Americans. Meanwhile, Putin's conditions for peace, they're clear, uncompromising. Ukraine gives up Donbass, rejects NATO forever, removes all Western troops. As Belarus's Lukashenko bluntly warned, without a deal like that, Russia will just gradually bite off, seize, and advance further, reclaiming territory. Putin himself said, "We will regain it. It is ours." Chilling. It is. Ukrainian leaders facing this emphasize that security costs. You have to pay for it. And sometimes you have to be ready to be alone in the fight.
Turning back to the nuclear angle, President Trump's order to reposition those submarines in response to Medvedev's threats, that adds a really high-stakes element, almost existential.
It's a powerful signal. Absolutely.
Critical.
This nuclear signaling is profoundly notable. Doesn't really matter if it was moving existing patrols or sending new ones. The critical point is the link, the perceived link, between America's extended nuclear deterrent in Europe and the presence of U.S. conventional forces on the ground.
You mean if U.S. troops aren't there?
Exactly. If American troops aren't physically in harm's way in Europe, if there's no visible commitment of U.S. lives, it fundamentally weakens the belief that an attack on Europe would actually trigger a U.S. nuclear response.
The credibility gap.
Right. That credibility gap pushes some European nations, like France, to seriously think about operating their own independent nuclear deterrent at a European level. Imagine the hurdles. Legal, political, financial, massive. Others, like Poland, say they're ready to host U.S. nuclear weapons on their soil. This is a truly critical reassessment of who bears the ultimate security burden in Europe and what immense costs, financial and geopolitical, they're willing to pay.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, the listener, and for global stability? The data, it seems unmistakably clear. America is actively, deliberately recalibrating its global defense commitments. The pressure on Europe to fund its own defense is intensifying like never before. And while some allies are answering the call, investing significantly, a substantial gap in collective security still seems to remain.
And these decisions, they carry immense weight. huge long-term consequences. They force Europe to confront its own strategic vulnerabilities, its history of relying on the U.S.,
Yeah.
and the very real costs of security in a world that feels increasingly dangerous. The long-term implications for global stability, they really depend on whether our allies can genuinely rise to this challenge of self-reliance.
Hmm.
Or if a further U.S. withdrawal inadvertently creates a power vacuum that adversaries are, frankly, eager and well-positioned to fill.
So here's a thought to leave you with. If the United States does indeed step back from its long-held, very expensive role as the world's primary defender,
Hmm.
will the resulting void truly lead to greater global peace and stability? Or will it embolden aggressive regimes, create costly new instabilities, and force a new, potentially far more dangerous international order? An order where the U.S. might eventually pay an even higher price down the road.